Robotrek. Not to be confused with the equally awesome Robotech. It's a take on the classic JRPG, but with something of a twist that actually makes it a little bit ahead of its time. Now the story follows you, whatever your name is. You're the son of an inventor and an inventor yourself. You've just moved into the town of Rococo, and essentially you're trying to improve everyone's lives with your inventions, and try and clear your father's name for messing up the town pretty bad with his inventions when he was a kid. However, your simple quest of trying to make the world a better place very quickly gets interrupted by a mysterious group of ne'er-do-wells known as the Hackers, who seem to just want to make the world a worse place every day in every way. And it sort of becomes your lifelong mission to figure out where they came from and put a stop to it. So the plot is basically constantly hammering home the point that technology can be used for both good and evil, and that is basically the entire premise. And while it's not really all that interesting a theme, I do have to give credit in the world they present to you. First off, not a ton of RPGs take place in modern times. I mean, on the Super Nintendo, the only other one I can think of is Earthbound. But secondly, for a game that focuses very heavily on technology, a lot of the locations you visit are actually a lot more natural. When I think of a technologically focused game, I would think a lot of grays and clinically sterile looking environments, and that gets very boring. Instead, they actually opted to go for a wide range of very bright and colorful, cheery environments. And the tone of the story in and of itself is actually very goofy. I mean, it stays true to its Japanese name, Slapstick, for being something of a comedy game, but it actually goes to some dark places as well. And I have to give credit where credit's due. It tries to cover a range of technological to organic, lighthearted to some kind of dark stuff, but all while doing it very naturally and not establishing any sort of weird shifts in tone. It feels like it handled the different tonal shifts very well. Not like other RPGs that come to mind when I think of comedy meets tragedy and just bizarre tonal choices. I'm looking at you, Persona 4. Now the gameplay itself is actually fairly unique for the time. First of all, no random encounters. All of the enemies you will fight you have to run into on the map. Also, the way you run into them will actually determine how the battle is fought. If you run into them, you will actually gain the initiative in combat, whereas if they run into you, they get a turn ahead of you. But the gameplay in combat is what makes this game truly unique. For you see, you're an inventor, not a warrior, so you're probably not that apt at fighting, which is why you don't fight. Instead, you throw out a capsule containing a fully customizable robot to fight for you. Yeah. See, a lot of people who look back at this game kind of see it as Pokemon, before Pokemon. This game came out 2 years before it, and it's definitely one of the earliest RPGs I can think of where your character doesn't do any direct combat. So instead you've got your robot to fight for you. And combat takes sort of a mix of active and turn-based combat. Your robot has a battery charge meter. When it charges to full, it can make a move, but it has to navigate around the battlefield to do so. It can move, it can guard, it can attack. What's interesting though is there are run commands. And what run commands are a series of moves your robot can be programmed to do. Like a melee attack followed by 2 more melee attacks, or 2 melee attacks and then a laser blast. But there's some really neat combinations that can actually end up changing the way you'd fight. Like one that I found was a melee attack followed by a bomb attack followed by a melee attack. Instead of running in that order, your robot teleports to your opponent and then slashes each one of them, and actually does some pretty impressive damage. This ended up being one of my favorite moves. And these run commands in and of themselves exist on sort of a risk-reward level, because each run command takes a lot of energy to power. A simple basic attack could take 1/5 of your charge meter, but a run command could take all of it. And if you have to sit here and wait for your meter to charge, you're going to be waiting several turns while the enemy just attacks you over and over and over. so you kind of have to plan out how you want to roll in combat. Outside of combat, it takes a little bit of preparation and strategy as well. You have to invent your robots, which means you have to find an inventor's workbench, which looks suspiciously like something else. Probably just my imagination. Anyway, you have to build your robots. You can build up to 3, and each one has its own statistical preferences. The first one has an edge in defense, your second robot has an edge in offense, and the third one has an edge in specialty attacks. Although, I don't think anyone has ever been able to discern what constitutes a specialty attack. Still, the fact that each of these robots is unique, despite looking kind of the same, means that you can kind of plan out how you want to go about doing things. Also, you have the ability to modify their stats at any time you're at a workbench, which means that if combat isn't doing it for you, perhaps the enemy is hit too hard, you can instead switch all of your stat points into defense, rather than, say, speed, or offense, or health. And the nice thing is, you can do this at any time, provided you can find a workbench. You also have access to a portable workbench every time you level. You can't invent robots with the portable workbench, but you can do pretty much everything else. This means you can change your stats in advance if you have a pre-planned strategy for the dungeon you're going into. This makes it very, very player-friendly, because you're not necessarily committed to any one statistic. If what you've tried doesn't work, try something else. It definitely rewards experimentation. Now that's not the only thing the workbench is used for. You can use it to build inventions like an animal communication device or a drill, which will be used for solving various puzzles throughout the game, but you can also use it to invent new weapons or repair your robots. Now, like all RPGs, leveling is something that's rather important. However, the full effect of leveling is never really felt, at least at first. See, in a standard RPG, your characters would get a stat boost, and then you get to learn a new move, or something like that. In Robotrek, when you level, sure you have access to the portable workshop for one brief use where you can reallocate stat points and recover your characters, but they won't learn new abilities. In fact, there really aren't any new abilities whatsoever, but the equivalent in this game is that every level your character becomes a slightly better inventor, which means he'll be able to understand harder inventor skill books, which means every time you level, your character has to go out, find a specific skill book, and learn the level. I thought this was really interesting. Not necessarily good though, because sometimes a dungeon would have specific skill books, which means you could actually lose the optimal way to do it if the dungeon closes behind you. Now there were other instances of these skill books, but you had to look for them. This also meant that the game was more or less telling you exactly what level you should be before moving on. And I don't think I like having a game dictate what level of progress I have to be at before I can move on, you know? But there is one massive flaw with leveling and stats and equipment, and that is that the progressive curve for stat gaining and weapons is a little bit weird. Every level you will gain 10 skill points for each of your independent robots. This means that you could have one specialized in offensive, and one specialized in defensive, and one specialized for making cookies for the victory celebration, because Robot 3 has been pretty much generally considered useless comparatively. But this means that there was generally one optimal strategy. You'd have Robot 1 exist as a backup to heal Robot 2, and you'd have Robot 2 as a glass cannon. And this did seem to work especially well for me, but that's not the full extent of the weird stat curve in this game. By being able to create a new piece of gear at every level, you very quickly end up replacing old stuff. But I don't think that the new pieces of gear were planned out terribly well. See, by level 10, you can get a very cheap, incredibly effective shield device, which reduces most damage on your robots to very little. In addition, provided you understand how to level independent weapons, by level 10 you can already have the most powerful weapon in the game. So you can start pulling some really, really dirty stuff by about the second or third dungeon. Now, that said, I'm not necessarily certain this is a wholly bad thing, because I think this sort of has Final Fantasy VI syndrome a little bit, in that you could really, really, really break combat. but you had to have a deeper understanding of the mechanics. But because combat is very basic when you get down to it, I think it's a lot easier to find ways to break it. And that's a bit of a shame. But overall, I will say that the gameplay was good and I enjoyed the combat. The game is bright, it's colorful, and there's a decent variance of environments. I do think you do see a few too many laboratory environments, as well as caves, and that does make it feel a little bit bland, especially when you go outside and you see volcanoes, or towns, or forests. There's just a massive contrast in color. And even the caves are bright and colorful, but I still think that there might have been one too many. And I think I would have preferred more dungeons to be outside. I also think that there isn't an incredible amount of variance with enemies. You will run into a lot of hacker enemies, which are basically just palette swaps of each other. Conversely, a lot of these palette swaps also have different weapons, which makes them play a little bit differently. So, in the end, I guess there's a decent amount of variance. I still would have preferred more character models, though. I do like that every piece of equipment you give your robots will actually change their appearance a little bit. That's nice. I'm definitely a sucker for equipment changing your character model. That's one of my favorite things, to be honest. In general, it looks pretty good, and it definitely has a sort of cartoony visual style that makes this game its own. So, big points for presentation. The audio is kind of a mixed bag. I think a lot of these songs are catchy, especially the town tunes. I've got the island town theme right in my head right now. But while the songs are good, they're not very long. Like, the island theme is about 10 seconds long and then it loops. And you do hear these songs a lot, so it does kind of get annoying a lot. Which is a shame because the music is actually pretty good. I just wish each song was a little bit longer, you know? In the end, I think Robotrek is a really, really cool game, and I'm honestly surprised I never heard of this game before. Especially considering that this game is more or less Pokemon before Pokemon was a thing. I mean, seriously, I have no idea why no one gives this game credit for its originality. I would think that would warrant it being at least kinda well known, but honestly, I don't think I've run into anyone who knows this game. There's tons of different customization for your robots, and you can do it on the fly, which means that if something's not working for you, experiment. Find something else that will work for you. There's tons and tons and tons of different options, and, well, I think that the equipment could have a lot more variance, because there's honestly only about 4 or 5 different pieces of each equipment. They all behave slightly differently, and I think combined with the ability to change your stats definitely makes this game feel very player-friendly and never wildly hostile. The only thing I've found about this game that made it kinda unfriendly is the fact that you can save everywhere, and that's good. If you game over, you have to go back to your previous save file. And if you're like me and you forget to save, like, a lot, like after 2 hours of recording and then get smashed by a boss and then you have to go back, that's definitely gonna put you off. I really, really don't like when games do that. But aside from that, this game is absolutely fun to play, and it's not only a beginner RPG, but it's also fun for veterans. And the nice thing is, it's not wildly expensive. If you want the Japanese version, it sits comfortably at $5. It does hold its price for an English copy, sitting at about $40, but it's worth the purchase. It's a beautiful game, it's very unique, and it's a ton of fun. And despite comparing this game to Pokemon, which is honestly apples to oranges, it definitely takes a concept that was popularized by it, and made it its own, and did it a lot earlier. And I think this game's honestly a little bit more fun, just because it's willing to give you that much more control and freedom over your character, and experiment with your style.